doing it to me for the last number of weeks. And I don't know what to say. I'm very grateful for that song that he sang. And I hope I'm not going to get really emotional up here talking, but I'm already feeling very emotional. If any of you ever wonder where my sermon ideas come from, they come from my own personal time with God in His Word. As I read and I study and I cry out and I wrestle with what is it that God is saying to Mark? What's the message that God has for me in my life and where I stand with Jesus? And some of you know I've been reading a lot of the Bible lately. And in particular, I've been reading a lot of the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount was one of those texts that if you go back and you read the early Christians, those people who lived just after the time that the New Testament was written, this was for them a primary and principal text that informed them of how it is that Jesus wanted them to live. That showed them in very tangible and practical ways, this is what it means to follow me. And some of you know I've been reading a lot of the early Christians too, because I've wanted to sort of clear out all of the preconceptions and the bias that have come with the baggage of hundreds of years of American Christianity and Western Christianity. You've heard me talk before about what would it be like if you could take this book and just go to a deserted island and erase all the memories and all the things you've ever heard about what the Bible really says and really means, and just read this book for what it says? Would you come up with what we have today that we call Christianity? The more I've tried to do that, the more my answer is no. What we have today is very, very different. And so I want you to hear that as I preach to all of us, I'm always first preaching to me. These are the things that I'm struggling with and struggling through with God and with Jesus. And I will tell you, one of the most challenging things I feel, the question I ask myself all the time as I read the Scriptures, endeavoring to read them as if it were the first time, as if I was one of those young Christians after the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, hearing the words of the apostles that are now recorded for us in the epistles of the New Testament, hearing their testimony about Jesus. The question I keep coming back to is, okay, now that I know, what am I going to do? And this morning I want to give you a slightly different kind of sermon. At least I think it'll be different. We'll see what the Holy Spirit does. I want to reason with you a little bit. And you know me, I like to start with questions. And so this morning I'm going to start with what may sound like a very silly question that I want to ask. You ready?
Okay.
Sure. I want to make sure you're awake. What if Jesus really meant everything he said? Let that sink in for a second. Maybe you're thinking, wait a minute, well, why do you ask that? Well, what do you mean, Mark? What if Jesus really meant? Of course he meant what he said. How could he not mean what he said? What kind of question is that? What if he really meant it? Well, let me tell you why I ask. I ask because when I look at my own life, never mind the rest of the... When I look at my own life, I often don't act like he really meant it. Often when I look at the teachings of Jesus, as I've been reading them, I'm convicted about how easy it is and how often we find ways to explain away what he said. instead of just taking it for what he actually said. We find ways to marginalize it or minimize it or justify it or rationalize it or adapt it to our culture instead of just taking it for what it said or what he said. Let me give you an example this morning of what I mean. I was going to give you a bunch of examples, and I don't know that we're going to get to a bunch this morning, but I want to give you one. Turn over with me, if you would, to Matthew chapter 5. And if you don't have a Bible this morning, I'd encourage you, there's probably one in the pew in front of you, or maybe there's someone next to you that has one. I don't want you to take my word for it. I want you to take God's word for it. Matthew chapter 5. This is the beginning of what is known as the Sermon on the Mount. Maybe one of the most famous sermons in history. In Luke 7 and following, Jesus gave a very similar sermon called the Sermon on the Plain. And I dare say most of us are very familiar with a lot of the expressions that we've heard from the Sermon on the Mount. He starts with what are called the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Have people ever heard that before? You heard that? Yeah. Blessed are the meek. We've heard that. Blessed are those who mourn. We're going to look a little bit later in chapter 5, starting in verse 38. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your brothers, what are you doing more than others? Do not even the pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Now, instead of doing a lot of deep biblical exegesis here, let's just read it for what it says. What did Jesus say? He said, if someone strikes you on one cheek, what do? Turn to him the other also. So, what does that mean? Maybe it means if someone strikes you on one cheek, turn to him the other also. He says here that we should not resist an evil person. That we should give to those who ask from us and not expect in return. So what does Jesus mean there? I mean, let's make it practical. And I may step on some toes here, but let's imagine for a second that you're at home with your family. And I'm a little bit speaking to the men, though I'm sure I'm speaking to the women too, but let's imagine you're at home with your family and someone breaks through the door. It's a home invasion. And they're there to do harm to you and your children. And you happen to have a firearm in the house. What do? According to Jesus, you do not resist an evil person. You don't repay evil for evil. You don't shoot back, according to what he said here, if you just take it for what it says. Don't find a way around it, just take it for what it says. Or how about if someone storms the church right now? Right? We live in a day and an age where we're afraid of terrorists. where we're concerned that they live amongst us. They're in our country. And we read all the time about attacks that are happening all over the world. So what if someone comes in, terrorist or not, someone just meaning to do us harm? What do? Unless you think maybe somehow I'm misinterpreting Jesus here, just listen to the words of Paul, an apostle, the apostle who wrote most of the New Testament. In Romans chapter 12 and verse 17, Paul says virtually the same thing that Jesus just gives us here in Matthew chapter 5. He says, "Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everybody. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, 'It is mine to avenge. I will repay,' says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." Does that sound any different than what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5? What does Paul say? Do not repay evil for evil. Repay evil with good. Your enemy? Feed him. Give him something to drink. Care for his needs. Love your enemy and overcome evil with good. So, what do these verses mean? Well, if you just read them for what they say, they mean exactly what they're saying. And I realize we live in a part of the country where self-defense and bearing arms and protecting our families is a deep, intrinsic value in our lives. But the question you have to ask is that a deep, intrinsic value of Christ and his kingdom? Is that what Jesus teaches? Is that what Jesus taught those who would follow him? What do you think someone in the first century would have understood by these words of Jesus? The good news is we don't have to wonder what people in the first century would wonder. It's because history actually records it for us. Some of that recorded history is right in the book of Acts. We can read about exactly what people did as violence was done against them, as rights were taken away from them. And we know what they did. But we also have writings of some of the earliest Christians, men and women who actually knew the apostles, who sat at the feet of the apostles and were taught by the original 11 and then with Matthias 12 apostles of Jesus, who studied under Paul in Rome. But in fact, let me just read you for a minute. By the way, if you're ever interested, this is an exceptional book. All this book is a bunch of those ancient manuscripts for us by category of what did the early Christians, the ones who lived in the first and second centuries, what did they understand Jesus to be saying and teaching? And you've heard me say before, they're not infallible. I get that. It's not the same thing as the Scripture. But they didn't have the language and cultural issues that we have today when we've got to try to figure out, well, what did that Greek word mean back then? Because it might mean something different today. And we don't have to figure out, the cultural issues. They lived in Jesus' culture. So what did some of these people say? Well, just listen to a few of the things that these men wrote. Most of these men died as martyrs for what they believed. They were held up as pillars of the early church. Here's one. They comfort, this is from a man named Aristides. It says he was actually converted in Athens during Paul's missionary trip to Athens, recorded for us in Acts chapter 17. They comfort their oppressors, talking about Christians, and make them their friends. They do good to their enemies. Well, there's another one by another man in Athens. He was a philosopher. He actually wrote the first great defense of Christianity and presented it to the emperor of the empire, Marcus Aurelius, around 170 AD. He said, "We have learned not to return blow for blow, nor to go to law with those who plunder and rob us. Not only that, but to those who strike us on one side of the face, we have learned to offer the other also." That was Athenagoras. Then there's a man named Irenaeus. He was a disciple of Polycarp, and Polycarp himself was a disciple of John, the Apostle John, who wrote the Gospel of John, who wrote the 3 letters of John that we find near the end of our New Testament, and who wrote the book of Revelation. And what does Irenaeus say? He says, and he's referring to Christ, he commanded his followers not only not to strike others, but even when they themselves are struck, to present the other cheek. He commanded them not only not to injure their neighbors, nor to do them any evil, but also when they are dealt with wickedly, to be long-suffering. Sounds exactly like what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, does it not? I'll read you a few more. "The spiritual man never cherishes resentment or harbors a grudge against anyone, even though deserving of hatred for his conduct." Here's Clement of Alexandria. Clement was an elder of the church in Egypt. And he wrote, "Paul does not merely describe the spiritual man as being characterized by suffering wrong." He's actually referring to the passage we just read in Romans chapter 12. Rather, Paul's not merely describing the spiritual man as being characterized by suffering wrong rather than doing wrong. Rather, Paul teaches that a Christian does not keep count of injuries. For Paul does not allow him even to pray against the man who has done wrong to him. For he knows that the Lord expressly commanded us to pray for our enemies. Christians are not allowed to use violence to correct the delinquencies of sin. Another elder of the church in Carthage in Africa, around the exact same time as Clement, he writes, "If dragged to trial, the Christian does not resist. Men of old were used to requiring eye for eye and tooth for tooth," quoting the same thing that Jesus did, "and to repay evil for evil. But after Christ has supervened and has united the grace of faith with patience, now it is no longer lawful to attack others, even with words." Do you hear their hearts? It's not just about not doing violence to people physically, not even attack others with our words. Nor to merely say fool without danger of the judgment. He's actually quoting from the Sermon on the Mount there. Christ says, love your enemies and bless your cursers and pray for your persecutors. Or here's another one. For what difference is there between provoker and the provoked? The only difference is that the former was the first to do evil. He's talking about the person who breaks into your home, or the person who does injustice to you, or hurts you, or treats you unfairly. That's the provoker. And then the person who responds would be the provoked. He said, what difference is there? The only difference is that the former was the first to do evil, but the latter, the person who reacts to being provoked, did evil afterwards. Each one stands condemned in the eyes of the Lord for hurting a man. For God both prohibits and condemns every wickedness. In evil doing, there is no account taken of the order. The commandment is absolute. Evil is not to be repaid with evil. And I'm just reading you a few tiny little blurbs from pages and pages of what the early Christians understood Jesus to be meaning by the passages that we read. So, is bombing ISIS, is that an option for a follower of Jesus? No. It's not an option. Jesus said, do not resist an evil person. And I realize this may be offensive to some of us, but how do you reconcile, we're going to go bomb the terrorists with following Jesus and his commands? This is one of the reasons, in my opinion, someone who is a Christian, someone who takes following Jesus seriously and literally could never be president of this country. Could you imagine? Could you imagine getting up on a platform and saying, no, we're not going to retaliate. We're not going to send military forces. We're not going to bomb them back. You can't possibly claim to follow Jesus and do that. What about shooting an intruder? Does that fit? It's very quiet. It clearly doesn't fit. Or what about, let's take it a notch down. Let's not talk about physical violence. What about taking somebody to court? Suing someone who's wronged you or who's affected your rights. So does the Bible speak to that issue? Well, in fact, it does speak to that issue. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, if you want to turn there. Starting in verse 1. This is Paul again writing based upon his understanding of what Jesus means when he says, turn the other cheek. If any one of you has a dispute with another, dare he take it before the ungodly for judgment instead of before the saints? Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if you were to judge the world, are you not competent to judge trivial cases? Do you not know that we will judge angels? How much more the things of this life? Therefore, if you have disputes about such matters, appoint as judges even men of little account in the church. I say this to shame you. Is it possible that there is nobody among you wise enough to judge a dispute between believers? But instead, one brother goes to law against another, and this in front of unbelievers. The very fact that you have lawsuits among you mean you've already been completely defeated already. Why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be cheated? Instead, you yourselves cheat and do wrong, and you do this to your brothers. He's talking about taking them to court. Is it an option for Christians to take Christians to court? For us to sue one another? Paul says, find somebody in the church, even some person of little reputation in the church, and let them decide between you. But the most convicting thing is he says, wouldn't it be better to just be wronged? To just be cheated? It sounds exactly to me like Jesus' words of turn the other cheek. Do not resist an evil person. You see, the only options that Jesus gave to us when we are wronged, he did give us some options. There were two. One of those options is to flee. And you see that in his teachings, and you see that in the early Christians' lives, that when they were threatened, when they were persecuted, they tried to escape, they tried to flee. But if they were not able to, they submitted themselves and entrusted themselves to God, who judges justly. By the way, that's 1 Peter chapter 2, if you want to read it about Jesus and his example set before us. The other option he gave us is to love. That's the only other option he gave us. Matthew chapter 5, after he says, don't resist an evil person, he says, love your enemies. And when you read the early Christians, they didn't defend their rights. They didn't stand and defend their homes. They didn't get involved in politics to try to change the policies and the politics of the government to defend their right to defend themselves. They fled, or they accepted mistreatment, and they befriended their enemies. After all, is this not exactly what Jesus himself did? Look over in John chapter 18. standing before Pontius Pilate, makes an amazing statement. Starting in verse 33. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "It was your people and your chief priests who handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Listen to Jesus' answer. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews. But now my kingdom is from another place." What an interesting thing Jesus says here. Pilate is asking Jesus, aren't you going to defend yourself? Aren't you going to stand up and say something? And Jesus' answer is simply, listen, if my kingdom were of this world, then yes, that's exactly what we'd be doing. That if my kingdom were like the world, then people would be fighting to prevent me from being arrested and to support me and to support my rights. But my kingdom is not from this world and is not of this world. No, in fact, it's a different kingdom entirely. And it has its own king. I'm that king. And it has its own set of rules. And it has its own set of values that stand in stark contrast and opposition to the values of this world. And so much of Matthew chapter 5 and 6 and 7, and frankly all the Gospel, is Jesus presenting and confronting us with the difference between those two kingdoms. That the kingdom of the world says, no, I defend myself. And I defend my rights. And I defend my family. That is not the kingdom of Christ. We're supposed to be different. We're in the middle of an election year. Maybe one of the most polarized elections, at least since I can remember elections, which is, what, 3.5, maybe 4 decades. It is unbelievable, just the churn of words and things that people are saying about this election. And I'm not here to talk about politics, because frankly, Jesus didn't talk about politics. But it scares me, the things I hear and the things that are said by so-called professing Christians, people who say they're following Christ. Even if I set aside the election, right? We live under law in the United States of America. That law is called the Constitution. And connected to that law, and part of that law is the Bill of what? Rights. Oh, you knew that one. Okay, so we're all there together. The Bill of Rights, in which our forefathers expounded on a series of things that they called inalienable rights, which is a big fancy word to say these are things that are intrinsic to who we are as human beings. And our forefathers in this country went so far as to say that those rights are inalienable because they're given to us by God. That's what they say in the Bill of Rights. One of those rights is one that we're talking about here. The right to bear arms. The right to defend ourselves. What's the problem? Nowhere in the Bible has God given us that right. Nowhere in the Bible. And I realize you may say, well, what about in the Old Testament where God commanded his people Israel to go and conquer foreign nations? You know, that's an excellent question. And I'm going to address that question next Sunday, talking about these two kingdoms. But the point is simple, that the kingdom that was very physical and very natural and had laws and had rules and for whom the reward was material prosperity. Right? For Israel, the reward was greater lands and more birds and greater cattle. In the New Testament, it's not that way anymore. God's not promising us prosperity anymore. His kingdom changed. The point was never to have a big nation with a military force that would go and conquer other nations. And that's why Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount says, you have heard it was said. And he's quoting the Old Testament. But I tell you, this is God's kingdom. These are God's values. This is the way we're supposed to live as citizens of his kingdom. We like to think of our country as a Christian country, don't we? But self-defense and protecting our rights, bearing arms, are not at all what Jesus taught. Not at all. Nor is it what his followers lived out in the centuries that followed his ascension into heaven. And the truth is, if we really believe in eternity, if we really believe in eternity, did you believe in eternity? Well, I'm not so sure based on that answer. But if you really believe in eternity, then why would we be so concerned about protecting this life? Why would we be so caught up in protecting this life and what happens here? If what happens here doesn't last. Just read the Sermon on the Mount. Overwhelmingly, Jesus is trying to get our eyes off of this earth, off of the things of this life that fade away, and on the things of eternity. If I'm that concerned, well, if I really believe in eternity, wouldn't I be much more focused on the obedience that secures my eternity rather than on protecting my rights? And is God himself not sufficient protection? Listen, I've struggled with this. I went and got a concealed carry license. I had firearms in my home that I'm now in the process of getting rid of. And I was one of those people who said if someone came to my home, I would blow them away. And God would be with me because, hey, he's a father. He would understand. He protects his children. I protect mine. But how does that fit with just reading Jesus and taking him at his word for what he said? How do I fit that in there? Isn't the best thing I could do for my family to secure their eternal life? And does that not change the perspective? If someone's coming in my home to do harm, at worst, they're expediting my trip to go home to be with Jesus. If I really believe this, the early Christians really believed it. How could I possibly say, as I'm pulling the trigger, I'm loving my enemies. I'm going to blow you away, and I love you. Did you see how silly that sounds? And in case you're thinking, well, I don't own a firearm, well, I'm never going to shoot somebody, it's not just about defending your home and using violence. We heard the early Christians, it's about something as simple as holding grudges, holding hateful anger towards people. Read a little bit earlier in Matthew chapter 5 what Jesus has to say about anger and about not resolving anger between brothers and sisters. It's about the things like taking them to court. How many people here have a Facebook account? Keep your hands up. It's okay, I'm not taking names or anything. Most of us have a Facebook account. It is amazing the hateful things that are said by professing Christians on Facebook about Trump or about Hillary or about Obama, about any of those people. And yet, what did Jesus teach us? I'll show you another verse. Great verse. 1 Timothy chapter 2. Again, this is Paul expounding upon what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, I urge then, first of all, that requests, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made for everyone, for kings and all those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. This is good and pleases God our Savior, who wants all men to be saved and to come to a knowledge of the truth. Paul here says we should be praying for our leaders. We all know that. We've read that before. Praying for our leaders. Interceding for our leaders. Not praying against them. And how does he say we should pray? With thanksgiving. That's not at all the kind of stuff that I read on Facebook by professing Christians about Barack Obama, about Hillary Clinton, about Trump. It doesn't matter. Pick your name. I've got a coworker. I don't have a coworker anymore. I guess praise God for that. It's old business. But I had a coworker, Mark, at my business. Awesome guy. I loved him. He was such a tremendous help to us at the store there. And he would talk all the time how concerned he was about the economy and how our economy is in shreds and so many people are without jobs and how the fundamental fabric and culture of American life has changed. And he's right. I won't argue with the things that he's saying there. But when he would start to talk about Barack Obama, literally, he said, if he were to walk through that door today, I would not be able to restrain myself to hit the man. That's how strongly he felt about our president. And I'm not condoning or minimizing or trivializing anything about the leader of this country. I'm not really saying anything about the leader of this country except that he is the leader of this country. My coworker is a professing Christian. And I asked, how does his reaction fit in to what Jesus and Paul have to say? Back in the days of those early Christians, there existed what was known as the Pax Romana. That's just Latin for Roman peace. It was roughly 206 years during the Roman Empire where there were no wars. There were no violent altercations with other countries. There were no invasions. There was no official military action with any other nation within the Roman Empire. Want to know when the Pax Romana happened? It went roughly from AD 50 or 70 into the middle of the 3rd century. Could it be? You realize, by the way, this is the longest period of no war in the history of the world. Literally in the history of the world. Can you think of 20 years in the last 100 of the United States history that we have not been at war with someone? I can't. But we're a Christian nation. I think those early Christians took Jesus' words very literally. And that's why, as Christianity spread throughout the empire, there was peace. It wasn't until Constantine, an emperor of the Roman Empire in the early 3rd century, said that he became a Christian and made Christianity the official state religion and polluted the church with lots of people who professed to follow Christ but weren't really serious about following him, that the quote-unquote church changed. So that within just a few centuries, within a century, the Roman Empire collapsed. The Pax Romana ended. And within just a few centuries, it wasn't just the Roman Empire, but the church itself was out fighting crusades and slaughtering heathens and slaughtering Muslims and unbelievers in the name of Christ. We followed right in suit with the world. The church was no different. And yet for those first early years, they were completely different. So what about us? What about us? How do we do with people with whom we differ? What about in this election year? that's so dividing our country? What about even in our fellowship when we have a dispute and an argument, we're not getting along together with someone, or we feel like someone has wronged us? Or what about in our extended families, which I know can be a challenge and can be hard? What about when people treat us wrongly and unfairly? Are we different? Or are we defending our rights, our judgment, our anger, our grudges? Or are we loving our enemies? I've given you one example. Just one. Remember my first question? What if Jesus really meant what he said? Did he really mean it? Do we take him seriously? Are we willing to set aside our preconceptions or set aside our values of what we think is right and what we want to hold on to and just take him for exactly what he said?
Amen.
Take him literally. The early Christians did, and they changed their world. But do we? This is just one of a whole bunch of very radical things that Jesus said. And I'm just talking the Sermon on the Mount. I'm not even talking the rest of the Gospels yet. Just the Sermon on, you read the Sermon on the Mount, it shakes me to the core. And I'll talk more about it in coming weeks. But I want to go back to that initial question as we close. Did he really mean what he said? And maybe more importantly, the question that I ask myself, what am I